But first, Scotland's new Hate Crime and Public Order Act comes into force today that criminalises threatening behaviour based on age, disability, sexual orientation and transgender identity. But critics say it will make the police's job a lot harder. Now, joining me now is Chris McElney, General Secretary of the Alba Party. Chris, what's your reaction to this law coming into force?
Well, good morning. Good afternoon, actually, now. I think it's bad law to start with. The issue mainly is that the police are going to have to investigate every single report that's made to them. The screen looks as if I've kind of turned pink on my end. I don't know if it's the same on yours.
It is, but we can still hear you, so let's persevere.
Good. So, I mean, the issue is, so if someone watches this or listens to this show today and they don't agree with something I say, even though it's clearly not criminal, they can report me to the police. The police then will investigate that, and that might not end up with me, getting any sort of criminal record against me, but it could end up with me being stuck in a criminal justice system, having to spend thousands of pounds to defend myself, my devices seized, etc. And that's why people are, quite alarmed that this will be weaponised. Across the UK, we have an issue with, the toxic culture of the trans rights debate. There's a real fear that many people will weaponise the new law so that people that are known as gender critical will have, hundreds of complaints made against them, which will lead to the police turning up at their door to seize their devices and ask them questions. So, it's a scary piece of law. It does, enter into territory that people will have to be careful that they don't say the wrong things in their own homes. And, there was already legislation going way back across the whole of the UK from 1986, the year I was born. So I don't think this legislation was needed. From a Scottish nationalist perspective, it's also concerning to me because, Scotland will never get itself towards independence if the people of Scotland see its parliament fixated on needless, costly and unwanted pieces of legislation. And that's obviously got to be a concern for all of us that believe in Scottish independence, but think this parliament basically concerns its time in matters that have got nothing to do with it, and it'll do nothing whatsoever to improve the lives of people across the country.
Well, Chris, stick with us. But Claire, I want to come to you because Chris made the point there about potential weaponisation. We heard the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, saying, he doesn't believe that would actually happen in practice. But do you think it might?
Yes, I do, because it's going to be down to what somebody believes and perceives to be offensive and whether that is going to be taken by the police. Now, Humza Yousaf said that there'll be protections in place, but Police Scotland, as we have already said, are going to investigate every single crime that goes along with it. I think also what's really concerning is at the moment this doesn't include misogyny, and the Scottish Government are looking to put a standalone piece of legislation in place to deal with misogyny, which is going to be even more fraught with danger, because who is to say what's going to cross a boundary and what harm is going to be done? So I think this is a really dangerous piece. And it was really interesting just listening there to Chris. What really needs to happen in Scotland is something that is going to make the lives of Scottish people better. And it feels like the Scottish Government at the moment, the SNP in particular, are messing around with something that actually doesn't concern that many people and shouldn't be high up on the legislative agenda.
Matthew, what do you think? Do you think this could make the lives of some people better if they have better protections in law?
We all want to protect people from threats and from abuse. But I do share some concerns about the long arm of this particular legislation. Let's hope very much that it doesn't work out that way. And don't forget, to involve the police is no small thing for someone to do in the first place. It does actually involve calling the police, or maybe you do it online. Some people these days, you can do it online. So that's not a small thing for someone to do. And there is also an offence, as we understand it, isn't there, of wasting police time. So people will have to think twice if they want to use this vexatiously. It's interesting just to hear you say that it doesn't at the moment include women. That was my mistake earlier, because I think I said that it was extending to age as well as gender, but is it right that it's not?
I think there's going to be a standalone piece of legislation which includes sex and we'll look at misogyny, because I think it was too much to put into one piece of legislation, so they've carved it out.
But that's the intention, is it?
That is the intention, yeah.
Well, Chris, I'm keen to come back to you here. I mean, what was the tone of the debate when this first went through the Scottish Parliament?
So, I mean, just to pick up on a couple of points there that aren't quite accurate. So there wasn't an intention to two separate standalone pieces of legislation. The government refused to include misogyny in the original bill, and they've effectively, Humza Yousaf's effectively been, forced into saying he will bring further legislation forward on that. And the other important point about, reporting something to the crime, the police is a crime is a serious issue. The police will take action against vexatious reports, etc. That's an important point, because this law is going to utilise third-party reporting, and an organisation, and they can feel offended on behalf of someone else without having to, actually provide the details of the person that was offended in the first place. There are organisations that simply just have Gmail accounts that you can email to report that you've been the victim of a hate crime, and that organisation will then go to Police Scotland with their version of the events as to why there was a hate crime. So what we're going to have is Police Scotland, who are already overstretched. They've already said that they won't, respond to the bread and butter of the normal sort of crimes that people expect when they phone 999, hi, there's been a crime. Oh, sorry, is there anything that we can do to help? They've already said that they're not going to respond to every single crime that they get because they're underfunded, but now they're going to have to respond to every single report that there's been a hate crime. And importantly, the Conservative MSP Murdo Fraser's actually been the person that's highlighted this. If the police deem, well, there's been no crime here, they won't record that there's been a crime, but they will record against that individual an incident, even though they've not committed any criminal act. So that's concerning. This, in terms of culture, it just adds to the gender recognition reform bill that the Scottish Government tried to bring through, and the UK Government stopped using what was known as a Section 35 order. But there's a real toxic culture that's, in UK politics. The Conservative Party, to a certain extent, managed to suppress it by not conceding to the sort of trans-radical movement that the Scottish Government has conceded to. But what we've been left with is effectively a government that legislates based on the whims of third sector organisations. What we're going to see, and I guarantee you this, next year you'll see a 10,000% increase in hate crime that's been committed against trans people. But there won't be an increase in hate crimes. But what will happen then is the government will use that as an excuse to fund these organisations, as if, it's the great concern of our age is that, we live in this, ridiculous country that people are walking about in fear of their lives. It's just not, I mean, if you lived abroad and you paid attention to what was going on in Scotland based on what Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf have said over the last 4 or 5 years, you'd think it was a horrible place. But it's one of the most welcoming, one of the most inclusive countries in the world. And I think it's quite sad that we've conceded that we're this country that needs, specific hate crime laws. But, when, to be honest, most people get on quite well with each other in Scotland. And the sad aspect of this is that the majority of hate crime in Scotland is racially aggravated, and it's based on religion. But this law doesn't aim to, improve those outcomes for those groups. This law effectively is going to just create a situation that we pretend we've got this massive problem in Scotland with trans hate crime, when it's simply not the case. And sadly, we're going to get ourselves into the situation that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names in Scotland will result in me being prosecuted.
Well, Chris, I'm curious about something that the First Minister said. He said that there has been an increase in hate crime. Do you believe that to be true, or do you think it's the case that because more people are online now, more people are kind of publishing things online, that it's a perception rather than a reality?
There certainly has been an increase in reports to the police. So there will be year on year, there's been a massive increase in the amount of crimes that have been reported. But whether that then leads to the police, charging individuals and then prosecutions being successful, I don't see that. I come from the west of Scotland and I'm a Catholic, so a group that historically would have been subjected to what we would call hate crimes. And I think over the last 30 years as I've grown up, we became a much more tolerant society. Things that were acceptable 20 and 30 years ago, songs that were sung on football terraces, the way people spoke about other groups in society, we've seen massive improvements. And I just think it's quite sad, as I say, that, for some reason we've conceded the narrative that Scotland, the country of the Enlightenment, that, many people think gave more to the world, with the exception of the ancient Greeks. Somehow we've become a country that needs specific hate crime laws because, we're a bunch of Neanderthals running about shouting names at each other. It's just simply not true. And it's indicative of a government that's ran out of ideas. It's forgotten that 1 in 4 children live in poverty in Scotland. It's forgotten that people can't afford to pay their energy bills when we're a land of energy plenty. And instead it fixates on these post-material issues that will not improve one single person's life. In fact, they'll make people's lives worse, because when they need the police, they'll find that the police are busy chasing someone that said something on Twitter instead of actually focusing on real crimes.
Chris, I'm just going to quickly bring in Matthew.
Yeah, Chris, I have actually a lot of sympathy for what you say, and I'm not a supporter of self-ID as I understand it. But isn't what you're saying that abuse, threatening behaviour and so forth that takes place online isn't real, whereas actually it may well be much more disturbing to experience this face to face, but it is still real, and that people do need to take responsibility for their actions online, and that some actions online are criminal. So you say there's going to be you predict there's going to be a 10,000% increase in the next year in anti-trans hate. Isn't that another way of saying that there is a hell of a lot of hatred directed towards trans people already out there?
Well, first of all, you're right. Social media, it's not a nice place. I don't think the state should have to pick up the price tab for, policing social media. The Meta, Facebook, Twitter, they have made some improvements in the last, say, 18 months, but they still don't go far enough. They still make it far too easy for anonymous individuals to have accounts, abuse politicians, particularly female politicians. But just to go to, an example. So, for example, if you and I right now said, we believe there's only 2 sexes, you can't change your sex. There's only 2 sexes, gender's a social construct, people that are born male that say they are a woman, that's just false, right? That could be our opinion, that could be our view. That's not criminal in any way. But if someone decides to record this interview, report what I've just said to Police Scotland will be duty-bound to investigate me. They can, using the powers of this Act, turn up at my house and seize my devices. They can then potentially, tie me up having to get a solicitor, pay all the money that goes along with that. That would be a very stressful, very, nasty
Chris,
experience.
I completely understand where you're coming from. Yeah. And on that,
that's what this Act enables.
And that should not be criminalised. And if it turns out that this Act does criminalise what you've just said, I would be completely on your side. But can you also differentiate, as I do, between what you've just said, hypothetically, and someone calling someone who has actually transitioned to a woman, is a trans woman, is legally accepted as a woman, calling that person a man? Again, I'm not saying it should necessarily be criminal, but you can see how that is very different to what you've just said, and that indeed it may be hateful. It may indeed be motivated by hate, and that's something that we don't want. We don't want to go backwards. Just because we recognise that there may be proper areas in which trans and women's rights clash, and those should be debated seriously and sensibly, that doesn't mean that we can just have a free-for-all with transphobia. I mean, someone called up earlier and called me a child, right? Now, that's just an example of the sort of abusive language that can exist on both sides of this toxic debate.
Well, Chris, quick round of reply. Do we want to hear from some of our viewers?
That currently identifies trans, do we think actually have gender recognition certificates and have the protections of the Equality Act?
Sorry, I didn't realise you were asking me a question. What was that?
Well, we've probably got 1,000 times more people in the UK say they're trans than have actually had gender dysphoria.
But you haven't answered my point, though. Should you call a trans woman who has a certificate a man? Is that not abusive? Is that not hateful?
But the whole concept of self-ID is I need to accept that they're a woman because they say they're a woman. So, respectively, if I go to the swimming baths with my niece and there's a man wearing a beard saying that he's a woman, I don't have to accept.
But we don't have self-ID. We don't have self-ID.
We've been good so far. I'm going to step in and referee. Chris, thank you for joining us today. But I'm very keen to hear what our viewers and listeners are thinking.